go along, because it's difficult sometimes. I find it anyway to remember a question at the end. So if anyone wants to stop me and just for clarification or to ask a question, just wave or something, and we'll answer things as we go along. So slightly off the top of the screen.
Apologies. Before I let you go, I promised everyone a vote on curry, didn't I?
You did.
Can people wave their arms if they want to join the group for curry?
How many have we got? 1, 2, How many tonight?
What's it? There's 9, isn't it?
10. So if I said 10, yeah.
Yeah.
Gives us a bit more.
Yeah.
Do you want to do?
Well, can we have ideas at this time?
Yeah, lovely. All right, if anyone decides later in the day they want to join in, please come and speak to this lady and this gentleman here. Do you want to give them a wave? Katie and Jonathan, sorry. Katie and Jonathan. If you change your mind and you want to join in with curry later in the day, let them know.
We're going back on the train, so we would have liked to, but we can't.
Oh. I know, but we'll have to try. We'll try and coordinate next year and let people know if the flight's going on afterwards.
Yeah.
So we'll pick that one up for next year's planning.
Great.
Thank you.
Good. So I was going to discuss 3 things today. First was just the new treatments for tuberous sclerosis and what research is going on at the moment and planned in relation to new treatments for tuberous sclerosis. And then I was going to talk a little bit about so-called clinical guidelines, and particularly about the new guidelines which have been published by the TSA. Ruth, have we got any booklets?
It's been in scan for everyone, but we've also got booklets. We've got the full, so we've sent it around to scan for everyone. We've also got some copies of the guideline here, and we've got some copies of the new Easy Read version, which we're developing to go out. We hopefully go to print next week. So if people would like to see them or get copies, then please talk to Luke here at the front. Or if people would like to take a look at the Easy Read and let us know what they think and have any comments let us know.
Is the scan in like a large format?
No, we can have a look at that for you. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't at the moment, but we can have a look, even if we just blow it halfway through or something, so that you can do it easily.
There'll be versions of the clinical guideline summary in the goodie bags that we're going to give everyone coming out. It's got the scan as well, so
Great.
yeah, so you'll be able to.
Yeah, but the Easy Read, I think they're in 16-point fonts, so they are easy to read, but we'll have to think about doing the scan as well.
And then the third thing, I was just going to very briefly mention where things are at in relation to genetics and family planning, in case anyone's interested in that side of things. So this first slide looks a bit complicated, but it isn't really. It's just to say that we should be very optimistic, I think, about development of treatments for tuberous sclerosis. And this is kind of the slide that I showed the medical students, because what it says is that if someone's got a common condition like breast cancer, which affects a huge number of people, we tend to think of that as one single condition, but it actually isn't. There are lots and lots of different types of breast cancer, and so as researchers and clinicians, a lot of work's gone into trying to split up these different types because they need different treatments. So a lot of the common conditions in modern medicine have been chopped up into lots of little rare conditions, and that's what's called personalised medicine. And it's quite an arduous business trying to sort out all these different types of breast cancer and work out how to treat each type differently. But in tuberous sclerosis, things are much more simple. There's the TSC1 and TSC2 genes, as are altered in people with tuberous sclerosis, and so this TSC complex is not working properly in people with tuberous sclerosis. And really all the problems that affect people, the medical problems that affect people with tuberous sclerosis, many of which Gez described for us, occur because these genes aren't working. So the same treatment ought to work really for all sorts of manifestations of tuberous sclerosis if the treatment is replacing effectively what the genes are meant to do. So we should be pretty optimistic, because once you found something like, we'll go on to the next slide, everolimus or sirolimus that does the job in many ways of the TSC genes, then these drugs really ought to be good for virtually every aspect of the condition. So these are the drugs, well these are the sort of structures of the drugs, and this is the one that Gez said he was on, sirolimus, sometimes called rapamycin, and this is the one that actually most people with TS are now taking, called everolimus. Not most people, but most people who are having one of these modern drugs are taking everolimus rather than sirolimus. But you can see from these pictures that these drugs are actually very, very similar. And I don't think there's any good evidence that one of them is any better than the other, either in terms of how effective it is or in terms of the side effects that they cause. So it probably doesn't matter whether you're taking sirolimus or everolimus. And I think they work in much the same way. So here's some pictures of some of the manifestations of tuberous sclerosis, which everyone in this audience will be very familiar with, and that these are the manifestations or complications of tuberous sclerosis that occur because the cells in the body are growing too quickly, so producing lumps and problems in the organs. So you can see the facial problems with angiofibromas. This is a scan of a lung, and this lung is affected by tuberous sclerosis, and it's full of cysts and proliferating cells that shouldn't be there. This picture is someone's kidney with a big fatty lump on it, which is an angiomyolipoma. Obviously that kidney has been taken out, which we wouldn't want to happen nowadays. And a brain scan, a brain MRI scan showing a SAGA or brain tumour in tuberous sclerosis. Again, like Gez told us, he'd had taken out by surgery. So, you can see this person certainly had surgery, and in the past this would have been dealt with by surgery, and in the past lamb would have been dealt with if it was very severe by lung transplantation, and of course these would be taken off by dermatologist or a surgeon as well. So in the past, tuberous sclerosis, the way you dealt with lumps and lumps was basically to take them out, but hopefully that's rapidly becoming a thing of the past. So many of you will have seen this slide, but I've put it up because perhaps not everyone has. And this is the result of one of the clinical trials. So that's a trial of everolimus versus placebo. And in this trial, there were about 117 patients, I think. 2/3 were treated for their kidney lumps, those angiomyolipomas. 2/3 of the people took everolimus, and the other third took a placebo or sugar pill. And the lumps in the kidneys were measured using MRI scanning, and the average length of time that people were treated in this trial was 9 months, so not very long. And some people were only treated near the end of the trial, so they were only treated perhaps for a few weeks, but the average was 9 months. And then what the slide shows is whether the lumps were getting bigger or smaller over those on average 9 months. And so if the lines are below this line here, each line represents a patient. All these patients who were taking everolimus for their kidney lumps, their lumps got smaller, and a few, just 3, seemed to get bigger. Whereas for the people taking the placebo, a few seemed to get a little bit smaller, a few seemed to get a little bit bigger, but overall, there was absolutely no benefit from the placebo. So what this clinical trial showed was that everolimus shrinks kidney lumps, and very similar trials were done for the brain tumours, almost identical trial, and again showed really a result that looked exactly like this again. And another trial was done for the lung condition, not measuring lumps in that case, but looking at how well the lungs were working, how good they were at getting oxygen in, and again, that was a positive trial. It showed that the mTOR inhibitor, in that case sirolimus, improved the lung problems as well. And then if we go on to the next one, Louise. This just shows what happened, because the trial itself only went on for 9 months, but then people were allowed to stay on everolimus if they'd been in the trial, and were followed up, in this case, for nearly 4 years when this slide was made. And what it shows is the proportion of people whose kidney lumps, the angiomyolipomas, shrank. And by either at least 50% in purple or at least 30% in brown. And what you can see that over the 4 years, actually the proportion of people whose kidney lumps shrank by at least 50% just steadily went up. So the good news here from this follow-up data was that everolimus doesn't just work in the short term, it works for these lumps in the long term. And it wasn't obvious, I think, to people that it would work in the long term, because for many cancers, for example, if someone has treatment for many cancers, the cancer can become resistant to the drug if the person's on it for many years. But that doesn't seem to happen in tuberous sclerosis. So again, that was good news. Okay, shall we go on to the next one? So this looks a bit complicated, but it isn't really. This is a trial that was done in America using the sirolimus or rapamycin ointment to treat people's facial rash. And there have only been 2 really good trials done, large trials done for the facial rash using the sirolimus ointment. And basically the scores, so the higher up the score here, the worse the rash is. So they all started with a rash that was baseline there, and then this group of people were given a cream that actually didn't, or an ointment that didn't actually have any sirolimus in at all, and you can see that after visit 7, so some months into treatment, actually they were really not significantly better than at the start. So not surprisingly, the placebo didn't work. This was a weak cream, a 0.1% ointment of sirolimus, and you can see that there was an improvement, the severity of the rash decreased, and this one was a 1% ointment, and so the severity of the rash was even more improved. So this, I think, was again a good positive result. It shows that the ointment does work, as I'm sure some people here today will probably be on this rapamycin ointment. It does work, but the stronger one works better than the weaker one. So people should really be having a 1% ointment. And we can talk a little bit, if anyone's got any questions about how can I get hold of this sirolimus ointment, then the answer is that you really need to get to a TS clinic or a dermatologist to get this prescribed, because the sirolimus ointment isn't yet licensed. It may be in the future, but it isn't at the moment. And it's quite expensive, and so usually getting it requires an application for the funding for it to be made. And so a GP won't be able to usually do this for you. So if you want sirolimus, try sirolimus ointment, get to a TS clinic or to a specialist dermatologist.
Excuse me, can you put that on need?
Sorry?
Can you put that on need?
On need?
No, without,
Yes.
without diluting it.
Well, it comes. The ointments are already made up at these concentrations. So if you're wondering, could you sort of get your everolimus?
Not a bad experience at school, but the
Yeah.
young epilepsy, things I was at school, the doctor, at the Paul Alexander in Brighton, prescribed me Physohex cream.
Yeah.
Didn't tell me to dilute it, and the instructions didn't say to dilute it. I put it on my face, in about a week, burnt all the skin off.
Right. Well, fortunately, that wouldn't happen with this because these are already diluted to the correct concentration. So you should be able to just put it on as it comes in the tub.
So the paediatrician, Dr. Trevor Mann, got a baby unit in Brighton named after him now. He said the best thing to do with that is put it in the bin, and he got me something else.
Good, I've only got you something else. But, a lot of people, I think, could get sirolimus ointment if they can get to the right doctor. But, if you go to the wrong doctor, you won't get it because they can't write a normal prescription for it yet. So,
Excuse me.
yes.
I just wondered if it interfered with makeup while we're on the subject.
Well, good point. So this sirolimus ointment is pretty gunky. It's not very nice stuff. So it will interfere with makeup. but you can put this on at night before you go to sleep, and it can work on the skin overnight. So the best thing to do really is there's some evidence that the facial rash can be exacerbated by strong UV light. So what I usually recommend is, if to first of all start these treatments early, don't wait until the rash is very advanced, but put on sunblock in the morning and put on the sirolimus ointment at night, so that it's not interfering with your makeup.
It's grainy, Julian.
Is it?
Grainy.
It depends if the person who's making up has made it up well or not. The answer is yes, because this is actually often made using sirolimus tablets, which the pharmacist is literally crushing up into
So
a powder.
it shouldn't be like exfoliating thing.
Well, I think if they haven't ground it up very well, it will still be a bit gritty. So and this is the problem. I think in the near future, probably a sirolimus ointment will be licensed and will be produced properly. But at the moment, this is literally taking sirolimus, mixing it up in a bit of sort of petroleum jelly, and then sticking it on.
How well the pharmacist is ground it out.
So it's a pretty rudimentary treatment, but as it does work.
Wouldn't it be better to pulverise it instead of grinding it?
Well, it would be better to get it into. It would actually, the best thing probably would be to have it in a solution to start with, and then put it in something completely different. But eventually, when a drug company is being paid to produce this, it will be produced in a better way than it is at the moment. But at the moment, it's a bit Heath Robinson, the way that this is done at the moment. Okay, so that was. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So in terms of, if you wanted to be referred to the TSC clinic, would the best way to do that still be through your GP?
Yes, if the the best bet is to go along probably to your GP if you're not going to a TS clinic. Look up through the TSA where the clinic is, and go along and present the GP with it and say, this is where I want to go.
Do your research before and present it to your GP.
Because the GP may not even know there's TSA, probably won't, unless they've got another patient with TS.
Okay.
So, TS may be affecting 1 in 10,000 of the population. Many GP practices don't even have a single patient with TS, so they just don't know where the clinic is. So
I've been to mine for a couple of years, and I know where that is. It's St George's.
Good.
I've been to it for a couple of years.
Well,
I think they've forgotten.
I hope they haven't forgotten you. That would be difficult to imagine. St George's is a very good clinic. So,
I've been to the genetics school as a mock patient. All sorts of
So you're helping them, they're not
No, I
helping
haven't
you.
done that. I haven't done that. Doctors, they just come up with all sorts of conditions they think I've got.
Oh, do they? Did you know doctors? Yeah.
We have to guess what you've got. And
they get it wrong, do they?
Well, you don't have to be obtuse and sort of try and make out it's not what
be
they
nice.
say it is.
Yeah.
Well, that's the words they use, by the way. They said, you've got to be honest, and say, yes it is, no it isn't.
Yeah. Oh well, keep going.
And they were talking about how neurofibromatosis, John Merrick's condition, is so much like tuberous sclerosis. Just the genetic makeup is similar.
Yeah, there are some overlaps.
The elephant man and all that.
But I think you should keep going, because the more of those exams that include someone with tuberous sclerosis, the more doctors are going to recognise it. So you're really helping.
We went to Whitechapel Hospital, because he was.
They give you 3 months.
London Hospital. Royal London.
Yes, they did. So that was the lumps and bumps. So basically the everolimus tablets, or if you're on sirolimus, the sirolimus tablets seem to be effective for all the lumps and bumps in the brain, the kidneys, the skin, that people develop with tuberous sclerosis. And so it's a good treatment. And but I'll come on to how they're used in more detail in a minute. So those things, there's no doubt, the lumps and bumps are effectively treated by everolimus and sirolimus. What was more recently found through research is that also some of the problems in the way the brain function is compromised in tuberous sclerosis, or can be compromised, can be improved by everolimus as well. So this is, of course, brain MRI scan. So I guess lots of people here have had brain MRI scans. And this one shows tuberous sclerosis, but it doesn't look too bad. There's no brain tumour. There are these funny white areas all around the place. These are the tubers that people with tuberous sclerosis have inside the brain. This is an EEG tracing, so a brain wave test from a very young person with tuberous sclerosis, and it shouldn't look like that. This brain wave test is very chaotic, and it shows really that there is seizure activity going on in the brain. And then on the right, I've got another type of brain scan called DTI, or diffusion tensor imaging scan, from someone severely affected by TS and someone who doesn't have TS. You can see they look rather different. And what these show is that actually the pathways, the neuronal connections inside the brain are unusual in tuberous sclerosis as well. So there's a lot going on inside, and it's unusual inside the brain in tuberous sclerosis. And the big question was, well, would everolimus help the way the brain works, given that its structure and its electrical activity can be unusual? So there have been some trials done. So this trial called Exist3 was a trial to see if everolimus might improve epilepsy. We've recently finished a trial. I can't remember if anyone helped with this.
I applied.
I think so.
I couldn't take part.
But not everyone would take part. It was very restricted, the entry criteria, but I'll give some results from this. And then these problems like autism and ADHD that are very common in people with tuberous sclerosis. No one's really done a trial yet to look at whether everolimus affects these things. So let's go to the next one, Louise. So this was the outcome. It looks a bit like that rash graph. It's very similar. So this is the outcome of this trial of everolimus for epilepsy and tuberous sclerosis. And to get into this trial, people had to have tried at least 2 anti-epileptic drugs that were not controlling their epilepsy well. And it wasn't an instead of, it was just an as well as. So in this trial, people were offered everolimus treatment in addition to the anti-epileptic drugs they're already taking. And there was 3 groups. Again, there was the placebo or sugar pill group, and then there was a lower dose group in blue, and then a higher dose group in brown. And what these graphs show is over just 18 weeks, so not a very long time span, what happened to the frequency of epileptic seizures. And you can see that people in the trial, their seizures got less frequent whichever group they were in. So perhaps just because they were turning up to the clinic and having their drug treatment looked after rather better. So even the placebo group improved. They had 15% less fits by 18 weeks. But you can see here that the group with the low dose had significantly less fits, and the group with the high dose of everolimus did even better. Although these lines look like they're probably going to join up the trial has gone on longer. So again, this was pretty good news. So what it showed is that everolimus, if you've got bad epilepsy, and you add everolimus to the other anti-epileptic drugs, in about half of people, the seizures are reduced. It was actually about a 50% reduction in about 50% of people taking part. So not everybody. So this is a bit different. In the kidney trial, virtually everybody who took the drug for their kidney lumps, the kidney lumps shrank. Epilepsy is more complicated, so about half of people who took everolimus, it improved their epilepsy. But it didn't completely stop the epilepsy in most people. It did in one in a few, but usually what it did was reduce the frequency of seizures. So, should we go on to the next one? Now this is this TRON trial, which some people might have helped with, or at least volunteered to help with. So this was the trial that we did in the UK to see if everolimus could help with basically thinking and learning. So sort of memory tests, and if anyone was in the trial, there were sort of computer tests to do and written tests to do. So quite a daunting sort of trial to be in. And these little dots are just shows where people came from, so really from all around the UK to help with this trial. And we haven't published the results yet. We've only analysed the data, and we're going to write this up for publication in the very near future, because the trial has finished now. And what we did, we treated people for 6 months, again either with everolimus or placebo, and the psychologists did all their sort of tests to see how well they were thinking, learning, remembering over a 6-month period, and then actually again 3 months after the drugs were stopped. And what was very interesting was that in the placebo group, 44%, so nearly half of people, had some improvement in their thinking and learning during the trial, which is a lot. We thought some people might improve. And we think that that might be because people kind of got used to coming in and were less nervous, less anxious. But anyway, a placebo group improved, but the group taking everolimus, which was 2/3 of the people taking part, actually 70% showed an improvement over the 6 months. So this was the first indication that perhaps everolimus might help with thinking and learning in tuberous sclerosis. So a similar set of experiments really have been done in mice with tuberous sclerosis, which is why we did this. So mice with tuberous sclerosis were treated with rapamycin, so very like everolimus, and the mice with tuberous sclerosis actually have some difficulty learning things as quickly as normal, and it was improved by everolimus. But it seems like it's the first data. I'd say it's only very preliminary. It's not like one of these big trials with hundreds of people in, but the results are promising. So, okay. So what have we got here? Yes.
Is it likely that with results like that it might go and become more is it looking like it might happen that randomizing can be used for people with benefit and then in the future, and if so, how long will it take until something like that is licensed?
So Julian, could you repeat the question, please?
So yeah, this is a
people
question
back
about licensing, and so if these mTOR inhibitors like everolimus and sirolimus really help people with tuberous sclerosis in other ways, not just shrinking the lumps, but also improving the epilepsy or maybe helping people to think more clearly or quickly, will there be a license to enable more people with tuberous sclerosis to have everolimus? And the answer is probably yes, but more evidence is needed. So these are the licenses so far. You can see, so there's 3 for everolimus, some of them going back now 7 years, but so everolimus is licensed for the treatment of SAGAs, the brain tumour, but the wording of the license is a little bit tricky. It says that SAGAs that are not amenable to surgery. But what does amenable mean, and who decides whether something's amenable to surgery? And most people take this to mean that the wording license suggests that you can use everolimus instead of surgery if it looks like the surgery is going to be tricky to do, but not necessarily in all cases. But as you may know, in some of the best centres in the United States, they haven't done any SAGA surgery for years because they treat all their cases now with everolimus. Whereas in the UK, many people are still getting surgery.
Surely it's cheaper to give somebody a tablet and to crank open their head. I mean, it's thousands and thousands and thousands
It does.
use someone's head.
It does. It's not that this surgery is ineffective. It can be a good treatment, but obviously it's a big thing to do. So in the UK, the health services obviously tend to be very conservative, and the availability of expensive drugs tends to be very limited. And so the US definitely approach SAGAs differently to the way they are approached in the NHS. But what I found is that if I go along to if I've got someone with SAGA and there's a question of surgery, if I go along to, or one of my colleagues who knows about tuberous sclerosis goes along to that team and says, well, look, you need to be considering this, and it needs to be discussed with parents, then some patients now are getting treated with the drug instead of surgery. But I think it's up to actually patients and families have to say, well, surgeon saying I need surgery, do I need surgery? Is it the only option? You need to question this. So that's the brain tumours. The angiomyolipomas. So at the moment, the licence is only for treating big angiomyolipomas in the kidneys. So the licence says that they have to be at least 3 centimetres across. So, pretty big, the sort of size of a tangerine. Or small tangerine. So, that's a pretty big lump in the kidneys. So it's a bit frustrating because we think that if angiomyolipomas were treated earlier, they wouldn't get to that size. But that's what the licence says. And in England, even though the licence is for patients over 18, children can also be treated with everolimus for their angiomyolipomas. In Wales, it's different. Wales is stuck rather rigidly to the licence, and we have great difficulty in treating people under 18, although it's not impossible, but it's not routinely available. And I think in Northern Ireland, each patient is dealt with kind of on an individual basis, and in Scotland, I think. So actually the way that the different health services are interpreting these licences varies around the UK. And then the most recent licence was for epilepsy on the basis of those results I showed you. So now in England, as of April, everolimus is available to treat refractory epilepsy, not any epilepsy in tuberous sclerosis, but epilepsy that hasn't been improved by at least 2 anti-epileptic drugs. In Wales, it isn't funded yet, and in Scotland and Northern Ireland, it can be funded, but again, not routinely, it's on an individual basis. So Wales is a bit behind on this one, but of course it's just at the end of the day, it's literally arguing about funding.
I think actually Scotland has made a decision now as well.
Have they?
So they are funding as well.
They're funding routinely now. Great. So, thanks for these. Let's go back on that one, sorry. So, for the lung problems, sirolimus is licensed in the USA, but not in the UK. But we can use it off license, and we do. And so, someone who has progressive LAM should have the option of sirolimus treatment. So that's usually only women. It's only a small minority of women who need treatment, but that should be available. And there's a very good LAM centre, as you probably know, in Nottingham. Professor Simon Johnson runs that, and I think, again, if anyone is affected by LAM and is frustrated that they're not receiving proper diagnosis or treatment, then they should ask for referral to the National Centre in Nottingham, where they will get a proper
So, Julian, can I just ask, is it normally women who get LAM more
Yes.
than men? Why is that?
I think it's the hormones.
Hormones.
Female hormones.
Or is it?
Yeah. So, men can get it, but it's extremely rare for it to produce any symptoms in men. If you do a scan, you might see a little bit of that around, but it's really a problem of women in the childbearing years. Okay, so and as I mentioned, there is this problem that even though drugs are licensed, it doesn't necessarily mean that the local health board or even the NHS at the national level will pay for it. And this, I think, is very confusing to patients. You think if something's licensed, sure they don't have it, and the answer is, well, it all depends where you live. Right. So what next for research on treatment? Well, there are a couple of things that really need to be done that are not yet being done. The first is these neurocognitive problems, that's the sort of thinking and learning side, and then neurodevelopmental problems, that's problems like autism and ADHD. There now need to be some big commercially funded trials, because they're expensive trials, to see whether mTOR inhibitors, everolimus and sirolimus, improve these problems. And those aren't underway yet. One of the big problems, I think, is that sirolimus is now off patent and everolimus is coming off patent. And so I think the drug companies are going to be less interested in funding these trials because they think it's going to be less profit for them in it. So it's where the public sector now needs to step in. So things like the Medical Research Council need to step in and enable these trials to be done, or big charities like the Wellcome Trust. So it's really up to us researchers to get the funding to do those things. The next thing is prevention trials. So all the trials that's been done at the moment, as I've described, people have already had the problem. They've either got a brain tumour that's grown, or they've got a big lump in the kidneys, or they've got bad epilepsy that can't be controlled with multiple drugs. And then you can get into a trial and get treatment. But it'd be much better if the trials were now designed to go very early to prevent the problems occurring in the first place. And this has been talked about for how many years, Louise? Quite at least a decade. And it's one of the great frustrations, I think, for doctors and families that these trials have not got underway. And why haven't they got underway? I think really because the medical profession, we're very conservative, and people are very worried about, oh, you know, what if we give these strong drugs to very young children, might it have some adverse effects? On the one hand, and on the second hand, the drug companies also worrying that we'll get some bad publicity if something goes wrong in a baby. But you know, these trials really do need to be done, and it's not through lack of effort. Darcy Kruger in the United States got together a group that met many times, wrote a grant application, sent it into the NIH, that's the National Institute for Health in Washington, to get this trial going, and it got turned down for funding at the last stage. I think probably because they were worried about, you know, risks. But it's a pity. It will happen, but it's been very frustrating. And then the other thing that's going on is a lot of research, some of it funded by the Tuberous Sclerosis Association, is going on into looking for better treatments, because although everolimus and sirolimus are very effective, they only shrink these tumours. They don't remove them completely, and as soon as the treatment is stopped, the tumours start to grow again. So people are looking for combinations of drugs that actually kill off the tumour cells completely. And I know that Dr. Andy T in Cardiff, for example, is doing a lot of this work, and hopefully that will result in better treatment still. So let's go on to the next one, please. So this is just about the rationale really for prevention. So this is a graph from a paper showing what proportion of people with tuberous sclerosis have problems in particular organs at particular stages. So this is birth here, and so this blue line, this is the heart lungs. So, you know, a lot of babies will have the heart lungs before they're born, but those of course disappear after. So in childhood they disappear. So that's not really a problem, but nearly all of the other problems, epilepsy, kidney disease, lung disease, most of these things really come on during childhood and get worse and worse. Yeah. So this is why prevention trials really ought to be in these first few months of life. Should we have the next one?
As a person who has Prenatal of my own, I would like to suggest that they are a little bit of a problem. I think all that you very much.
They are for some people.
That did go away, but it did have a lot.
Did you get a lot of arrhythmias from this or something? Yeah. So, but most people don't. Whereas, you know, 80% of people will get their problems with the kidneys, or 90% perhaps with epilepsy. So I'm sorry if I made it sound best. But they generally cure themselves.
Yeah,
in
mine
time.
went away for you.
Yeah.
I'd be interested.
Yeah. Presumably without any special treatment. Whereas the other thing.
Because of where it was, they kind of opened me up.
Oh, did they?
Oh dear.
They closed you up again?
They closed me up again and went, go and plan a funeral for my mum.
Oh, that was wrong.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
And she's still
Thankfully. This is a slide actually, there's a Dr. Lee Shen, again one of my colleagues who works in Cardiff, and he's done a lot of work to try and look at this question of prevention trials, but he's done it in mice with tuberous sclerosis. So there are mice that have been genetically engineered to have tuberous sclerosis, and this is a kidney out of a mouse with tuberous sclerosis, and you can see it's got lumps and cysts in it, just like the person would have. And these are the very earliest signs of the kidneys developing abnormalities. So this is basically in a very young mouse, and these funny little areas here, which probably won't be very visible from the back, but the individual cells here are much bigger, and these are the start of the tumours in the kidneys at a very early stage. And what he's shown here is that if you give rapamycin to a little baby mouse just after it's weaned, it won't develop any of these lesions at all. So the black shows the numbers of these things, lumps in the kidneys in mice at about 1 year of age if they haven't been treated. And these are the ones that were treated from just a few weeks of age. And you can see that basically, if the treatment started early, they don't develop. So, I think it would work in people as well. Okay, so we'll go to the next one. Okay, so that's about research into treatments. I wanted to quickly mention these clinical guidelines, which you will have to get access to if you haven't already, either online or in the bags that people can take away. So clinical guidelines, it's quite a modern trend in medicine. So what are clinical guidelines? Basically, it's a set of things written down that are meant to assist doctors and patients in getting the best care. So rather than depending on someone remembering, it's written down in a document, and the doctor or the patient can say, I should be having this scan or this treatment. And they've got very common. So this is just a graph going back to 1985 here. And these were the number of guidelines for different diseases that were published in any given year. You can see in 1985 there were none, and then by 2010 there were 1,000 guidelines a year coming out. So guidelines have really proliferated in medicine. But one of the issues with these guidelines is having good quality evidence. If you don't have any evidence, it's very difficult to write a good guideline. So it's very difficult in a very rare disease like tuberous sclerosis to write a good guideline, because very often there isn't much evidence out there. And the evidence is categorised, the quality of the evidence, and we talk about the best quality evidence is from these randomised controlled trials, these big trials like have been done for brain tumours and kidney tumours. Category 2 evidence is less good, and that's from other research studies, perhaps these smaller ones like the TRON study we've done, which is just a small study. And then the worst possible level is expert opinion. So that's people like me, who should be largely ignored probably, and certainly are in guidelines. So the guidelines that you might have seen, because I think these are available through the website, aren't they? Who was the link to these, or is it the TSA Alliance's website? But you might have seen these ones over the years. These were the guidelines that were last published internationally, and this was based on 2012, a meeting in Washington where they got a lot of experts together and reviewed all the literature and said, okay, well, what should we be doing? So that's 7 years now, so it's inevitably a bit out of date. And these guidelines looked at how should someone where you're suspected or newly diagnosed is, how should they be investigated, what sort of monitoring should be done, and what sort of treatment should be given. So, should we have a quick look? And then Sam Amin from here in Bristol, so this is the home city of the UK guidelines, looked at those international guidelines from 7 years ago and said, look, these are a bit out of date, and they're also a bit American. So he got some UK guidelines together with help from various clinicians, and this is the booklet produced by the TSA, and there's also a sort of scientific publication in the medical literature based on this as well. And again, it looks at people who are newly diagnosed, people who've got TS, what monitoring should be done. One of the things, perhaps the weaknesses of this, is that the guidelines are kind of for everybody with tuberous sclerosis, and as everyone here knows, tuberous sclerosis isn't the same in everybody, it's different in everybody. So they're only guidelines, they're not rules, and they're based perhaps on the average person. But for instance, as a geneticist, I know that people with TSC1 associated tuberous sclerosis have very different severity of problems on average from people with TSC2 mutations. So shouldn't we be taking that into account? It hasn't been taken into account yet. So the guidelines, I'm sure, will continue to evolve. But let's have a quick look at what they say. So if someone has newly diagnosed tuberous sclerosis, this is what is recommended. So get some genetic advice and a genetic test, a brain MRI scan, a the TAN checklist. I don't know if people are familiar with this. Some people will be probably. This is tuberous associated neuropsychiatric disorders, so a bit of a mouthful. But it's basically looking at psychological and psychiatric and social issues in relation to tuberous. So those should be reviewed. Seizures should be reviewed, and EEG should be done. That's a brainwave test. Kidney scan, best by MRI. If that's not possible, perhaps a CT or an ultrasound, less good but sometimes easier to do. And then blood tests for kidney function. An examination of the skin and the heart, an echocardiogram and an ECG. And then in women, if they're a bit older, so sort of teenagers through to menopause, a lung CT scan. So it's actually quite a lot, of stuff that should, we feel, be done when someone is diagnosed as tuberous sclerosis. And then what's probably even more interest to everyone here is, well, what should be done thereafter? So what sort of monitoring? And again, it's quite a big list, but these, as I say, these are guidelines. It's not that every single person with tuberous sclerosis needs to have all these done, but at least a discussion should be had with the doctor as to whether or not the examination, the investigation should be done. So brain MRI scan, up until the time someone's 25 years of age, should be done every 1 to 3 years. Pretty big difference between doing one every year and every 3 years. But basically, if everything looks pretty okay in terms of there's no evidence of a saviour, then you can leave things longer towards 3 years. If there's any doubt, and perhaps there's a lump in a place where a saviour would cause trouble, then you do the brain MRI scan more frequently. But that's a pretty big ask for someone, particularly if they need general anaesthetic, for instance, for an MRI scan.
Excuse me, Julian.
Yes.
Is there no mention of examining relatives or siblings?
Sorry, that was in the, I think in one of the previous slides. I wasn't going into in detail, but the genetic test and advice. Yeah.
It's implicit in that genetic test.
So genetic test and advice. So, because absolutely right, because in a third of people with tuberous sclerosis, other relatives will have the condition as well, and sometimes that may have been overlooked. So
it's not possible to have TSC1 and TSC2 mixed, is it?
Not well. I don't know that anyone ever has had it. No.
Well, I know a case, a friend of mine whose mother's got mixed dimensions, has got vascular and Alzheimer's,
as well.
and other conditions might be similar as well.
Yeah.
Like cancers.
Yeah.
So therefore, it doesn't apply to TS.
It could apply to TS, but it would be very rare.
1 and 2 mixed together.
Yeah.
I guess it could be the fact that it's never been a viable pregnancy.
Well, there mean different symptoms, or
No, I
two types.
Yeah, but it
Yeah.
might be the fact that if pregnancy would have happened.
You'd certainly expect it to be severe if it ever happened, very severe. But I'm not aware of any really well documented examples of that happening in TS. So, brain MRI scan, this TAN checklist, so asking about development, asking how a child's getting on at school, and doing something about it in terms of trying to liaise across with the educational psychologist and the school, usually means writing to the school about these problems that develop in tuberous sclerosis, what needs to be done in terms of extra help and one-to-one provision. And then repeating that at these sort of key areas as someone goes through their development. And then in older people, just asking about mental health and making sure that any mental health problems, which are very common, are addressed. Seizures, the guidelines recommend vigabatrin, of course, for any baby with infantile spasms due to tuberous sclerosis, and it really does seem to be making a difference. So it does seem, looking at the data available, that quick, effective treatment with vigabatrin for a baby with tuberous sclerosis associated with seizures improves the likelihood of having minimal effects on development and learning. So again, for anyone with tuberous sclerosis, if they have a baby, the baby's at high risk of tuberous sclerosis and infantile spasms, it's really important to get them treated very quickly with the right drug. And nowadays, that is generally happening. And then AEDs, that's anti-epileptic drugs, so obviously many people with tuberous sclerosis will have epilepsy, many people will need more than one anti-epileptic drug. And in England, but not yet in Wales, if they're not working, ask about everolimus, because it will help a lot of other aspects of the tuberous sclerosis. So,
Is it easy to get on now?
is it easy in England
Yeah.
to get on it? It's been absolutely impossible until a month ago, because it wasn't funded, but now it is funded, and you should be able to ask, but only for people whose epilepsy is resistant to other
Yeah,
cheaper
so on
drugs.
to drugs at home.
Yeah.
It's not controlled.
It's not controlled. So you should be asking about this. And particularly, the funny thing about these licenses, they're all for individual things. You know, you've either got the brain tumour, or you've got a big kidney lumps, or you've got epilepsy that's resistant.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of people will have a combination of these. And so I think within the TS clinics, we're trying to move to a point where you know, a more holistic approach is taken.
Yeah.
You know. So I think it's definitely worth asking.
Okay.
But you wouldn't have been able to get this except in a clinical trial until April this year. But you do live in English, do you? Because you live in Wales. You will. So, kidneys. Again, this may seem a little bit over the top, an annual MRI scan. It really depends how much kidney involvement there is. But these kidneys can usually be scanned at the same time as the brain. It takes a little bit longer, but you know, if someone's having an MRI scan, and particularly if they're having a general anaesthetic for an MRI scan, which some people do, then the kidneys should be done as well. And usually, if the doctor writes, you know, why both things need to be done together, they will do. Again, that's a change. In the past, people often given these things scanned separately. Skin and heart, very much as we described before, and the lungs. This business of a lung function test, if LAM is present on the scan. A lung function test is basically okay for mildly affected people, but if someone's got more severe problems due to their tuberous sclerosis, it's very difficult to perform the lung function test adequately. But I would say anyone who's got LAM and any breathing problems associated with it should really be asking for a specialist opinion in Nottingham. That's where we're going. Okay, let's nip on to the next one then.
Sure, say something before we move on. Certainly recommend having no regular scans. So I had just a general scan, like MRI on my kidneys, and found a tumour which I had removed last year. So you know, I have no previous experience of any kidney problems at all, although I knew there was TS present in the lumps, but you know, like, unlike some people we know, you know, I haven't ever had any problems beyond the lumps being present.
Yeah.
And certainly last year was really the first time that the kidney prevented itself as an issue for me to worry about.
Yeah.
I found nothing and wouldn't have known anything about it if it wasn't for the scan.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely right.
Yeah.
You know, so particularly with the kidneys, because everyone's born with two kidneys, which is kind of over-provided. You know, we can run quite well on just half or less than half of one kidney.
Yes.
So by the time, say, a kidney function blood test shows some problem, the kidney disease is actually very advanced. So, so the scans are very useful for picking things up at an early stage.
My tumour was 4 centimetres, and you know, it sort of had different appearance in the scans to other ones, and it sort of flagged up with no concern straight away. And as you say, I've had a partial removal of the kidney, so I've lost about a quarter of it. But you know, that's not really been a problem since in terms of them doing the job, and it's just about recovery now. I think it's just definitely my heart's going to say make sure you have a regular scans. If I didn't have it, I'd still be on the wiser.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things that's done quite well in childhood, but then in adulthood, particularly if people have had kidney problems, and perhaps they're mainly under a neurologist looking after epilepsy, then very often the kidneys get forgotten. And we do see people in the clinic, in our TS clinic, who haven't been for a while, we say, when did you last have a kidney scan? We have a look, and it was 10 years ago or something, and that's
I've
obviously...
I've gone quite a few years without one. It was only really because of my neurologist's suggestion that I
Oh,
did
good.
one.
Oh, well, the neurologist, that
He did a
neurologist,
good job for me.
that's a neurologist who also thinks about the kidneys, so that's
Yeah.
good. But do remember, they're only guidelines. Everyone at TS is different, so these guidelines need to be interpreted. But it's very good, I think, to actually have the little booklet now from the TSA that people can take along and say, it says in here I should be having a kidney scan. Why haven't I had one? And if the doctor says, well, you did have one, you're 40 years old, you've had several scans, they've never shown anything, you really don't need to be doing these very often at all. You don't need to be doing them. So at least the question will be asked. So discussing and agreeing. As I say, monitoring will change over time because the guidelines are based on current evidence and the evidence will evolve with more research. So they're not set in stone. These guidelines, I'm sure, will be different in 5 years' time from what they look at the moment. And the last thing is don't wait for the monitoring test. So the monitoring tests are screening, so they're really meant to pick things up before symptoms. So if you're getting regular monitoring, say a kidney scan every couple of years or a brain scan every 3 years, and you have some symptoms like the epilepsy is much worse or you've got bad headaches, don't wait for the next monitoring. Get these symptoms investigated. That's very important. Okay. So, very few words. Have I got 2 minutes or not, Louise? We're out of time.
Yeah, we've run out of time, but
We've run out of time. Okay, I'll do this very quickly. It's just to say, if someone's mildly affected by tuberous sclerosis but is worried about the implications for family planning, see a clinical geneticist, because there are these options: prenatal diagnosis, non-invasive prenatal diagnosis, basically a blood test, and PGD or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So these are ways of just trying to ensure, if you want, that children born to someone with tuberous sclerosis don't inherit the tuberous sclerosis, but all of them require the TSC1 or TSC2 mutation to have been found in the affected adult who's going to be a parent. So if you haven't had a mutation test, you can't have any of these things. Sorry.
I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
I have 2 children, I have 2 children after finding out at TS, and I had chorionic something during my pregnancy.
That's this first one, really. Yeah, that's this one. Yeah.
It sounds, that picture
That is
makes
it.
it look so much worse than it is. It's not horrible. The waiting for
The result,
result
yeah.
is scary,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's not anyway. I mean, I had it done and then went round the Metro Centre afterwards, so
Yeah.
it's not terribly awful. And so it's horrible. They know you. They don't just stab you with a knitting needle. I'm just going to say that if they're more scared about
So
it,
this
it's
is
not scary.
anyway, it's very accurate. It does look a bit scary. Sorry?
I
Yeah.
was just going to ask about siblings, because when Keris was diagnosed, we were told that her siblings had a kind of an equal risk of having children with TS, and that they should undergo screening. So is that still...
Well, I would say, if a sibling's worried, the thing is, even if there aren't any symptoms of tuberous sclerosis, the best bet is to have a genetic test if the mutation's found, because if they don't have the gene change, their children won't inherit it.
Okay, so
So that's the best thing.
So it's for
So
them
most
to
siblings
genetic
won't
test,
need to
okay.
worry about any of these prenatal
Okay.
issues. Shall we quickly do the next one? Because there's only a couple more, I think. This is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is really a form of IVF. So now a lot of babies are born by IVF. I think in Denmark, 1 in 10 or something is now born by IVF. And you can combine IVF with a genetic test, so that all that's happening is the baby is born effectively as a test tube baby, but born without tuberous sclerosis. It's quite involved, but the NHS will pay for this to be done in one of the number of expert centres around the UK. And then this is the newest thing, it's called non-invasive prenatal diagnosis. So you mentioned that you've had the CVS test where they stick a needle into the womb.
Anyone near as bad as people may have.
But it does have a small risk of causing miscarriage. It's tiny. It's in good hands. It should be a lot less.
It's 3%.
Yeah, and in good hands it should be less than that now. But there is now essentially a blood test has been developed which can detect if the baby's DNA has a gene change in it. But obviously, if mum's blood has TS, it will be found. So this will only work if it's dad who has TS.
That's so clever because like baby's blood and mum's blood become like ones and stuff.
Yeah, they get kind of mixed up. So you can
really
find the baby's DNA in the mum's blood. And obviously, if the baby's inherited TS from dad, you can find that in the blood. So, but again, this is something that needs sort of sorting out. Ideally, someone who thinks they want to do this should go along with this amount before pregnancy. But this can be done as about 9 weeks or so into the pregnancy, and exactly. But it's only possible if it's dad who has TS.
Does that work on the second child at the first? There was a first pregnancy that was also.
Yeah, because the DNA doesn't last very long. Yeah. Okay, so there we are.